Realizing this is the first time we're using this particular thing, so
Yes, and now it is recording. We just recorded that. That's great. We can cut that out,
Yay!
or we can keep it. You never know.
practice. We're practicing.
CJ and I tend to keep the bloopers. Anyway,
We do.
That's right. Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Plot Geek Academy Podcast. I'm Troy.
And I'm Jenna.
Sorry, I was like, who's next? I'm CJ.
She's like, who are we? What are we doing?
We promise, guys, we'll get better at this as we go. We'll eventually have a nice little pattern and everything, and we will be so programmed. It'll be great.
Yeah, we're going to be so pro. Oh, come on. Who are we kidding? Anyway, welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone, to the Plot Academy Podcast. We're going to talk a little bit about who we are, first of all, since this is our first episode, and what we do. And then we're going to talk about our topic over our first few things is going to be writing to market for a sustainable and passionate career. And today we're going to talk about who you are and what you're willing to do for an author career. But before we do that, let's talk really quick. Jenna, why don't you talk to us about the 3 C's, craft, create, and career, that we talk about here at Plot Geek Academy?
Marvelous. When we were talking about how we wanted to help authors get educated, we really kind of broke down the process all the way from idea to getting it out there, marketing it, and doing cool things with it. And that's where we came up with the 3 C's with craft, create, career. And everything that we do will fall under the 3 C's. It might fall under just one of them, or it might kind of pull along through things. A lot of stuff does. But especially as you start looking at, we're going to share courses and all that kind of thing, you'll start seeing these markings all over the stuff we do, craft, create, career, because that's kind of our whole thing. And it's craft is getting those ideas and getting them into a manuscript. So it's the plot, it's the craft of creating your stories, it's all those kind of neat things. Create is now you got a manuscript. What the heck do you do with it? Where do you find cover designers? How do you work with an editor? What do you mean it has to be formatted? We'll help you figure all that out. And that's part of creating. And then career is that next step that says, who are you as an author? How do you present yourself? How do you market this book that you've created? How do you get to a conference? How do you kind of do all that kind of stuff? So that's that whole thing. And then we tie it together with what we call the right to market approach, which applies to all of these. And CJ is going to tell you what the right to market approach is all about.
So the right to market approach is this idea that you can actually be commercially successful and enjoy it without selling out to the man, as some people. We really don't believe in this notion of a starving artist. We really think that you can be smart and enjoy this process and love what you write and love what you do, but also be smart about that as well and find the right market for it. So the right to market approach has everything to do with looking at what people want to read and then understanding those expectations, whether it's certain sub-niches of sci-fi, romance, fantasy. It's important that you write what you want to write, or it's important that you write what you know people want to read, or it's important to do both all in one. We like having our cake and eating it too. And we want to teach you guys how to do all of these things and how to determine this, because there will be moments when you go, no, this book's for me. I'm writing for an audience of one, and that's okay as long as you have those expectations in place and set. And then there will be moments where you say, I have a book idea and I have no idea where to place this sucker or how I should do that. And so we want you to write the ding dang book and not be afraid of that, but we also want you to be smart about it, especially when it comes to goal setting and understanding your career path. So when it comes to the right to market approach, we're talking about sustainability, we're talking about passion, we're talking about merging the two so that you can have a very fulfilling career, no matter where that path or trajectory takes you. But we want to educate everyone on how you can do that. So we're going to talk about first steps in figuring that out. Troy, who are you? What are you willing to do? So, Troy, how do we understand ourselves as writers?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned cake, because there's a lot I would do for cake. I'm just saying so that's kind of who I am as a person. But first of all, cake, brownies, oh my goodness, baked goods in general. These guys are experts at creating them. I am an expert at consuming them. I am excellent at it. If you put a brownie in front of me, I can make that thing disappear. I'm like Houdini. Anyway, okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is understanding yourself as a writer. And the first thing about that is identifying who you are as an author. And that has several different parts to it, kind of like, what do you want to do? What do you like to write? What do you like to read? Those types of things. And one of the steps there is determining your preferred genre. So why don't we each, starting with Jenna, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you discovered your preferred genre and what that really means to you?
Okay, this is fun. So I knew I wanted to write in fantasy and science fiction ever since I was really, really young, because that was my very, very favorite thing to read. And the whole speculative range, it calls to me with a siren voice across the stars, and I must write to it. So I always knew I wanted to do that. But the interesting part of the journey for me was that I actually have 3 pen names, and I write in multiple different genres. And romance was the one that really slapped me upside of the head, because I always knew, okay, romance subplots and yet relationships are important and whatever. And then it was a challenge with a friend where I ended up with, I won a pre-made cover for a romance book. I didn't even try to win this. I just suddenly had a pre-made cover for a romance book. And, this goes back to my very frugal grandmother. I can't own something and not use it. So I had this cover, and a friend of mine reads romance just voraciously. He loves it. And so I went to him and I went, well, do you think that with your help, I could write a romance for this cover, intending for it to be a one-off? We will try this once and see what happens, and ta-da, and away we go. And so we wrote a romance that totally didn't go with that cover. We thought it went with that cover. Turns out it totally didn't go with that cover. So I never did use the cover. Sorry, Grandma. But we wrote it, and it was so much fun that I ended up also becoming a romance writer. And so I've written a whole bunch of romance. And then the nonfiction thing kind of snuck up on me as part of education, because I've always enjoyed presenting for people and educating people. I used to do a lot with food. This goes back to the baking thing. I used to present to teach people how to dip chocolates and this, that, and the other. And then I started doing it about writing. And that's why I write recipe books, and I write nonfiction about writing that goes in that center. So that's how I found my genres, has been this experimentation, and sometimes just having a cover slapped in front of my face with a challenge of, can you write it? So CJ, what about you? Because I know you too went through some interesting ins and outs to get to all of your genres.
I did. I would say that it's really interesting, because I grew up reading Nancy Drew mysteries, Hardy Boys mysteries. Then I graduated to, the hardcore stuff as I got older that wasn't quite so light and fluffy. But in my mind, I was going to be an investigative journalist. I was going to be, a cop. I was going to do all of these things. But what is so funny about this is that even though I was interested in it and wanted to do all of it, inevitably, when I wrote little stories for friends and family as like Christmas gifts, it was always the love factor. There may have been side subplots of intrigue and suspense and thriller, but what really called to me were relationships, even though I thought I was writing mysteries or thrillers, or because there is that addition to it. There is that intrigue there. And so as I got older, what I was really doing was writing music. I was a singer, songwriter, performing, and I had a good friend of mine, Jennifer Griffith. We were at the same bookstore. I was signing CDs, and she was signing books. And she said, if you can write a song, you can write a book. And she was lying through her teeth. She just wanted me to go to her writing group so they could have more people in their writing group. I have called her out on it multiple times, and she still denies that she lied. She says it's the same thing. And so, I had to learn the art of writing a novel. But this idea of fantasy and romance and action and suspense, which has really come to be, teen and young adult romantasy now, is what we would, label all of that as. That didn't really come to fruition until I started writing The Healer, which was my first book, which was terrible the first time I wrote it. I didn't know anything about writing a novel. And Jen was so kind about showing me that I did not know anything about writing a novel. So that's where I kind of dove into it, because I had to learn the ins and outs of these different aspects and understand the difference between main plot, subplot. What was I really writing? Because my tendency was to write everything all at once in one book. And that was not, so Jen was like, what story are you trying to tell. And that was how I started to get on this path of, oh, there are actually genres and subgenres within romance. And maybe there are different reader expectations within those. And so it was easing into that and figuring out what I couldn't do within a specific sub niche of romance. But that's where I stayed, even though I started out with Nancy Drew. Dang it. So, sometimes the road is very unexpected. What about you, Troy?
I kind of went on a similar journey. In college, I was in honors English with this guy named Phil Mickelson, who you may know because he kind of went on to do some golfing stuff or something. So at least one of us got to be. Anyway, and I was the nerd in the corner writing sci-fi novels, and I wrote several sci-fi novels during college, and they were all absolutely terrible. I'm still so thankful today that no one ever accepted those because they were absolutely terrible. But when I started then really taking my writing seriously, what I found was that even though I had read a lot of sci-fi and fantasy, and I thought that was going to be my home, that pretty much I was writing mysteries and thrillers and action adventure and stuff like that. So I would write a sci-fi novel and it would have a mystery in it, or it'd be a mystery in space, or I'd read a fantasy and it was a mystery with dragons. And I'm like, oh, that's really interesting. And so I was like, okay, this is really my voice, is this kind of action adventure thing. Now I have written some romance, but all of it always has that action adventure, thriller, romance, or thriller type thing aspect to it. So that's really where I found my author voice, which was really interesting to me because I did not think that was going to be where I lived. And then, of course, I write a lot of nonfiction because I like to write instructional books for writers to try to teach them the things, not to make them the same mistakes that I made, obviously, when I started out. But I also just really enjoy helping people. And I've also ghostwritten a lot of nonfiction, which was really, really fun. But nonfiction is a little bit of a different beast. It's almost like not a genre. It's almost like a whole category all of its own. So this is kind of how we determined our preferred genres. I mean, you can do it by asking yourself questions, and another thing is just by writing a whole lot of stuff. But also what we need to talk about is, what is your life like? What other things pull on you that you either can't or don't want to push aside? So tell us about that, Jenna, like about the stage of life that you're in now and the stage of life you were in maybe when you started writing, and how that's changed and evolved.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, so I started writing many, many, many moons ago. My very first book, I was all of 13 years old. I sent it to Tor Publishing, and they wrote me a very, very nice rejection letter that said, yes, they didn't call it a Tolkien ripoff, but we all knew that that's what it was, because that's one of the things we do when we're young and we've been reading way too much Tolkien, is we try to write our own. And that's actually a really good process as far as practice. It's very good practice. It is not going to get you published, and it's definitely not going to get you published with Tor. So Peter Doherty actually wrote me a nice little letter that says, keep trying, kid. It was great. So that was my first novel, and that was, easier back at that time because I was in high school and I wrote stuff after school, and all of those things were great. So then when I started getting serious about it was more in college. And at that point, I was writing to survive. So I wrote a lot of stuff, and we're going to talk more about this. I wrote a lot of stuff for other people that was based on what they wanted, and they paid me money for it, and I paid rent with it. So this was the commercial side that we have talked about, where it was, I don't know that I care about any of this stuff, but I will learn about it, and I will write lots of things. I wrote for the Deseret News. I wrote for Las Vegas casinos that needed pamphlets about how to play Hold'em poker, various other things. And so I worked on that. And then, it's just been lots and lots of processes as I started putting books out. And for me, one of the big things is I went through 2 bouts with cancer. And something like that, a big physical thing, is going to knock your writing right off its heels. And I had to accept during those times that while you're in cancer recovery, you don't write a lot. But that's the time you learn a lot. That's the time you absorb a lot of story. And so your life things change. And right now, I am the mother to the world's most beautiful and adorable 11-year-old. And I have grown children and a grandson that comes over and visits. And I'm in a very different life place where now I can churn out several books a year, because I can say, once the kid is in school, I have this huge chunk during the day during which I can write, I can edit, I can do other things. That also means that summers are a loss. They're a total suck, except for going to conferences, because she's here and I don't want to miss that time with her. And so it's looking at that life and saying, this is where I am, and this is what I can produce, and this was what is reasonable. And it's really important to hit that, because it's easy to start comparing yourself to other people and wonder why you're not doing as much as they are. My best friend and writing partner, all of her kids are grown and away, and she lives in India with her husband, and they're there from the States doing stuff. So she has all day, every day, with nobody bugging her. And strangely, she outwrites me by at least triple. So that's where we're getting at here is what is your life like, and what's your reality? Because if you try to be something you're not, you're going to get frustrated. CJ, talk about things that I've missed.
Well, I think that health was a really big one. And I think that people need to recognize that you got to give yourself grace. Please do. Don't make yourself more sick by attempting to write or meet goals that are just not attainable or sustainable. They need to be attainable right at the beginning. And then remember seasons of life, what your work expectations are in order to pay the bills versus what time you have to actually write. I think the thing that is so helpful, especially with someone like me where I struggle with ADHD and focus and overwhelm, and a lot of people do, is that I have to block periods of time out where I look at that and I say, okay, let's do this now. Even though it's not every day, at least it's Saturday at 2 p.m. and that's what I'm going to do. And so even though I don't write every day like I used to, because at one point in my life, I had kids in preschool, I had kids in school, and I got 3 books out that, three books out that year. And it was so great. Other times I had health issues. Really the point we're trying to make is you will be more productive at different stages of your life, and you will have different opportunities at different stages of your life. And there are times when it's okay to slow down and focus on one thing, and times when you will hit the ground running, and that's good too. But perspective is always very key. And if you can just recognize that as long as you're moving forward, even if it's just an inch at a time, or if it's a yard at a time, as long as you're working on something, that's okay. And that's important, even if it's just once a week. These are the things that I've learned. Do you want to follow that up with anything else, Troy? Oh, you're muted, Troy.
Oh, man, I was muted. I'll just say I'm at a unique stage in my life because all my kids are gone. When I kicked them out, I went for distance. Last year, my youngest was on another continent. So I thought that was kind of an accomplishment there. But what it does is it changes my writing life, which you'd think means I just have tons of time to write, but that's not true. I mean, it just means that I also have other obligations. I have grandkids. I have kids, grown kids that for some reason still need their dad. I'm like, get independent, girl, but they don't do that. That's not a real thing. And so we all have real lives regardless. So when you look at somebody else's life, don't look at them and go, oh, well, he writes full time and he's got this, on easy street. The answer is no, that's not true for anybody. Everybody has different challenges. Everybody has different things in their life. And I especially want to emphasize health, because things like writer's block, because you're not healthy or because you're struggling with something, are very real. And you should be able to forgive yourself enough to give into that. That is a reality. And sometimes you can't write because you're on drugs for something you're dealing with. And hey, it's just too much for you. And your brain isn't working the way it's supposed to work. So anyway, all of that is just kind of my quick little addition to that is you're at different stages of your life. So it doesn't matter. You need to forgive yourself for that. So the last thing we're going to talk about in this particular episode is, what is your definition of success?
I have one thing that
you
I
have more. Of. Okay.
So I'm going to keep it really, really brief.
Okay.
While we're talking about these things, also understand that in some places you will have to make sacrifices, and you will have to say, here are things that are important, but here are things that I'm willing to put aside. So maybe right now, if you spend, if you spend 6 hours a day sewing, you're going to have to decide, do you want to write more? Do you want to sew more? That's a different thing than if you have a small baby in arms. You it's a lot harder to say, baby, you will now go and do this other thing while I am writing. I mean, they do take naps, which is nice. But some things you have a lot of flexibility with, to say, this is the thing I'm willing to put aside in order to give that time to my passion to write. Other things won't be put aside. And you have to look and very seriously say, am I letting something that could be put aside keep me from writing and using it as an excuse, which usually means there's something else going on in your psyche about your writing? Or is this something that really is a limitation that I need to accept and adjust for? All right, now I've said it. Go back, Troy.
Oh, that's a great segue, because part of what you're willing to sacrifice and what you're willing to set aside is determined by your definition of success. If you want a career as a writer, there's a certain level of sacrifice that really you're going to have to accept. If this is a nice hobby and you want to do it on the weekends, do it on the side, you just want to write things for fun, that's a whole different topic. And the first topic under this is that a career needs to be sustainable. And what that means is this is like a fad diet, right? Like you can go on a fad diet for a few months, but it's probably not something that you can sustain for life. I can't give up cake forever. It's just not going to happen, right? But I can give it up for a while and eat lots of vegetables. But if I'm going to maintain my health and maintain my weight, I'm going to have to come up with something else that's sustainable. It's the same thing for writing. Don't think you're going to go in and you're going to write a NaNoWriMo project of 50,000 words. You're going to say, that was easy. I'm going to do that every month. You're probably not, at least not at this stage in your life, right? Your career needs to be something sustainable. So you need to determine how much you're willing to sacrifice for that. And also at the same time, when you're talking about a career being sustainable, you need to talk about like what kind of career that you want. So what are some of the stages that you guys have been in, and like what does those career decisions look like for you?
Well,
take it, CJ.
I started out, in all honesty, this was fun, right? It was for funsies. It's my favorite phrase, by the way, because I'm 10 apparently. I really did start out just saying, so what is this world of writing? Because I had done it very amateurishly, very just, here's a Christmas present because I'm poor. Here's a little fun story that's 30 pages long that I hand wrote with love that you will probably never read again, or you'll take and never read it all. But, thanks, because it was well meant. So when I started in with my writing group, I did not realize everything that I did not know. You don't know what you don't know. You don't realize that writing a book, there's so much to it. Writing a story is not easy. And that's why not everybody does it. And when they do, that's why not everybody can do it well initially. There is craft, there is technique, there are fundamentals to it. And so usually I found that with my ADHD, I had a pattern of starting things and then stopping, because it was very hard for me to get grounded and get into it. When I latched onto this idea of story, fundamentals, plot and structure, dialogue, all of the character development, the science behind story, it was so fascinating to me that as I slowly started to move through it, it started to mean more. It started to become something valid other than just, I want to write for funsies, which I did because I wanted it to be fun and enjoyable. But then I was looking at that and I remember having a really just clear, like amazing moment when I went to a conference, my first conference, and it was after 2 workshops where I was just eating and consuming. When you're new, you don't know anything. So it's just, the floodgates are open and you're trying to understand it all. And it hit me for the first time. I think I was like 27, 26. I was old, unfortunately. And I sat there and I thought to myself, this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. I have finally figured out what I want to do with my life, because before that, I was doing what I wanted to do in my own personal life as far as family, being a mom. I'd always wanted to do that. But as far as a career, there was never anything that really I felt strongly about. And that's when it switched from hobby to this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life. On some level, in some way, I will be part of writing and publishing. And now it's education. So it has changed. It went from writing, it went from publishing, it went from getting my own books out there, learning the ropes of that entire process. And now it's not just me doing that for myself. Now it's so much fun for me to teach other people. So that has graduated as well into the types of things that I do for this career, when it's not just writing and selling books, but it's also paying it forward and sharing with others. So that, you really do, you change. It changes, and it will continue to change, I'm sure, for me when I go through more ventures and more scenarios. I mean, joining Jenna and Troy, it's a new venture and nothing I would have thought of 5 years ago, ever. Never would have thought of that. Course creation, all of those things. So it really is interesting. But at first, you really have to decide, what path are you taking? Is it funsies? Is it a career? Are you making money? So Jenna, do you Do you want to talk about kind of your path for that as well?
Yeah. So I knew from the time I was tiny that the two things I wanted was to be a mom and to write books. And I knew that from about the age of 8. But the interesting part for me was figuring out that whole how to make it a sustainable career. Because guys, when you first put out your first book, there's this part of you that says, I'm going to put this out and I'm going to make $1 million and I'm going to, dance through the daisies and money from heaven and all that kind of stuff. And then you realize that doesn't happen very often. Lightning strikes, hits sometimes, and you get somebody with their first book, it just takes off and it's amazing. For the vast majority of working authors, most of us are blue collar kind of authors, and we do make good money, but we've had to work really hard to get there. And so this was the thing I learned as part of mine to make it sustainable, is that I'm also a certified software quality engineer, because I had to do something that was going to consistently make money all the time. Because even while I was writing things for other people and I was getting paid for it, it was not enough at a certain point, because I started having things like house payments and car payments and all those things that happen when you get out of college and now you have to pay for yourself. And what I was making writing was nice, but it was not enough. It hadn't become a career at that point. I didn't have good enough craft. I didn't know my audience. So I was having fun and making side gig money, but I needed a career that made sure that I did not lose my house and home. And that was actually really, really good for me, because it helped me to structure my days. It helped me to have money. And sometimes you really need another career that takes the pressure off the writing to produce cash in order to keep the creativity flowing so that you can write books that make cash. So I've had to learn that balance. And then as I've gotten older, I've been able to put aside that career for the most part. And now the writing does most of the work. But it takes time, guys. And that's probably the biggest thing I put in there, is that for most of us, you're not going to launch that career with your first book. It's going to be something you do side by side. And then more and more, it will become the career, while the other stuff is able to then do something else. Or maybe not. Maybe having that other stuff always will make you happier, to be able to say, I have a part-time job where I do this and it fulfills me in one way. And then I have a writing job and that fulfills me in another way. That is still a sustainable author career. So, all right, Troy, did we miss anything?
Absolutely. Well, what I will say is the reason that a lot of writers come into their own in their late 20s or their early 30s is very simply the 10,000 hour rule. And for a writer, that generally means you wrote about 1 million words. And I can guarantee you that I wrote about probably well over 1 million words of crap before I was able to write my first novel. But my first novel was a commercial success. The first one that I really released, it was a commercial success, which was a problem. And people are like, why was that a problem? Well, because then I thought the world was just waiting for whatever I was writing next. So, hey, why bother with all that marketing stuff and the things I did for the first one? There's a whole group of people. They're just waiting for the next thing that falls out of Troy Lambert's typewriter, and they just want it. And guess what? It wasn't true. And so I had to reset with that second book and go, okay, time to relaunch this and figure out my life, because this is not the way things work in the author world. So it took a while to figure out how to basically make a living. However, the advantage I had was I did some freelance work, and then I had a fantastic boon of some freelance research contracts for the federal government. And it taught me some very important things. The first one was, it taught me that my words were worth money, and potentially a lot of money, because the federal government, well, anyway, that's a long story for perhaps another podcast, but I put your tax dollars to work. I can tell you that, writing things, right? I mean, I know I'm your hero. It's okay. Just calm it down. But anyway, so I wrote a lot of reports for the EPA, stuff like that, right? And it taught me that my words were worth money. It also taught me that just because someone had a degree and a lot of letters after their name didn't mean they could write. The writing was an actual talent. And some of those guys with doctorates, I don't know how they got through their dissertation. Probably somebody wrote it for them, because there was no way they couldn't write their way out of a paper bag. They couldn't write a email that was cohesive, let alone write an actual report or an actual book. So I learned that being able to tell a story and being able to write was something that was a talent that not everybody had. And so it was that ability that taught me, okay, this can be a sustainable career. Maybe I am going to do freelance. Maybe I am going to do editing and other stuff on the side. And eventually education took over a lot of those things as well, because I was like, well, Now I've got a lot of things to tell people because I'm the guy who doesn't make the same mistake twice. I make it 4 or 5 times just to be sure. And so I can warn you off of all kinds of things that you shouldn't do as a young writer, because I tried all of them, some of them several times, just to see if I was going to fail absolutely again, which I did miserably. So it took a while to figure out this way of making this a sustainable career and something I can do for the rest of my life. And I have to constantly battle, because of who I am as a person, not doing too much and burning out. So that's another, sometimes you have to say no, and you have to not do things so that you can pursue the things that you really do love. So that's another danger, is the burnout danger. Now, let's talk about if your goal is to make money primarily, let's just go around, kind of round robin, and do some pros and cons of money as a motivation.
I like to eat. I am very money motivated. It's like what Troy says, if I want my cake, I must be able to pay for it. We do not live in a world where things just appear for us, as cool as that might be. So it's okay to, and we get this a lot. You're an artist and words are supposed to be free and creativity should flow, and therefore you should be a starving artist, which we think is utter crap. You don't need to be a starving artist. You can say, here's a thing that I wrote because the muse wanted me to, and I don't care if it's commercial, and that's fine. You can say, I wrote this thing. I have one book that I wrote for my mom. It's stories about her kids growing up. Nobody else in the entire universe cares about this except for our little family. It will never be a commercial success. It was worth every penny that I put into it. Now, I told you about my romance books. Those are workhorses, y'all. I write them because they're fun, but I also expect them to make their money back and then some. That's their job. And so part of why I write those and part of how I write them is financial. So to have it be your primary goal that all words are going to make money, that can get really, really hard. It can be hard on your creativity. It's easier to do in nonfiction because you can generally take that emotional step back. Like Troy says, if the APA wants you to write about something, it doesn't matter if you're passionate about it. It helps, but it doesn't matter so much. You fill out all the forms, you write the things, they give you thousands of dollars, and you say, thank you very much. So yes, if the only goal is money, you're going to end up frustrated in a lot of places, because when a book doesn't sell, what else do you have to look forward to, right? But you can have money be a part of it. And that's what I have to say about that. I like to eat, therefore money is good.
CJ, do you also like to eat? Let's hear
I
your
do like to eat, and money is good. The cons of money being the only motivation, and I think this should be something that we've touched on, Jana's touched on, you've touched on, Troy, is that the pressure is then on for all creativity to be monetarily advantageous. And many times when you're writing with that level of pressure, when you are writing to sustain yourself, that can cause a lot of burnout. And it can cause a lot of writer's block, because the thought process is, if this isn't gold, I can't make gold. And so you really need to consider how you work, because some people function really well with serious deadlines and that level of pressure. I have learned I do not. And so for me, I have to have a sustainable career on the side of writing, because my creativity takes a nosedive the minute that level of stress is involved, when my financial support is solely dependent upon my writing. And that's simply how I am. So because I know those little, the ins and outs of my psyche and what happens to trigger me to just stop writing, it's like my brain goes, no, you have just given me so many things that I am now responsible for. Feeding you cannot be one of them at this point. The only responsibility I have is making you go to the fridge and get something out of there. I cannot be responsible for making sure that I'm the mastermind behind all of your financial, it goes off on this tangent, and suddenly I am in the fetal position on the bed, not able to write at all. So, and that's me, full disclosure. So you've really got to decide the pros and cons of where you find joy in this. There have been moments where I've simply written stuff knowing it was crap and going, I'm okay with that because it's crap, but it's crap I love and I must write it, and no one will ever see the light of it. No one's going to see that. It's okay. So pros and cons when it comes to motivation. I think if I were to boil all of this down, it would be what motivates you specifically, because this is a unique journey for you. Okay. You've got to figure this out. either before you begin the writing journey or as you go, and recognize that it will also morph. It's going to change. You won't have all the answers, but have some, please. Some will help. Some is going to help you out. Okay. Anything else on that, Troy?
The main thing I'll say is that when people tell me I want to write for a living like you do, I go define make a living. Okay. I drive a 2007 Ford. I rent half of a house from my friend's mom. I mean, I do have some great stuff, but I don't have a lot of stuff, and I don't need a lot of stuff. I'm very frugal with the way that I live. And of course, now I don't have kids at home, so I'm not supporting them except for occasionally at a distance. But anyway, that's a whole other topic. But anyway, but you need to define what you mean by make a living. If you're young and you think that means a house in the suburbs with 3.5 bedrooms, 2.5 dogs, and 1.5 kids, or however that works, then maybe you want to reconsider and have a career that's a backup that you can count on. Because there's easier ways to make money. The other thing about money as a motive is money as a motive doesn't last the majority of the time. It will fail you at some point. There will be some point when you have lost the joy and you realize you could make just as much money making Kung Pao chicken at Panda Express. And you're like, I'm quitting this writing thing and going. And I'll tell you a story. A friend of mine was an entrepreneur guy. He does tutoring and all kinds of online learning stuff, and started his own business. And he came to me, and after he'd been doing it for about a year, and he's like, I don't know how you do this, man. He goes, like, at least twice this year, I've wanted to quit and just go get a regular job. And I'm like, man, dude, you are doing well. I go, at least once a month, I have those moments when I consider that maybe a greeter at Walmart is a viable career. And maybe I could go do that and just get a regular paycheck like everybody else. I'm like, if you're only thinking about that a couple times a year, so realize that if you do make this a career and money is your motive, there's going to be some times when that's just quite simply not enough to sustain you and keeping going. Now, if the goal is just to get your story out there, what are some of the pros and cons of that? I think the number one is probably expectations. But what are some other things that we could talk about related to if you're just going to get your story out there and that's all you want from it? What are some of the pros and cons to that?
I think that frequently people think they just want to get their story out there. What Jenna and I have run into, and I'm sure you have, Troy, is that people will then come to us and say, well, I just wanted to get out there. I just wanted to speak my truth. The amount of times I've heard that. and I'm like, that's great. So what's the problem? You spoke your truth. It's been published. Yay. And then the response is, well, it's not doing anything for me in the form of monetary advancement. And so then what we're realizing is that they lied to themselves. You lied to yourself about your goal. You lied to yourself about your motivation. And clearly it wasn't just about getting the story out there. So if it is just about getting the story out there and you happen to make some money on the side or get speaking gigs or, whatever it is that you did, yay, congratulations. That is a happy icing on that cake that we love so much. But you really need to understand that if you didn't have a plan to make money with it, then you won't. You most likely won't. So pay attention to that and your real goals. That's why we're telling you to think about it now, because it needs to be thought about now.
Yeah. And some people luck out. I'm going to call it luck out, but it does happen very frequently that it just happens that the thing you're passionate about writing, because you're an avid reader, will also be the thing that other readers want to read. And I think that's part of where people also get confused and why we get really intense about knowing what your audience wants and knowing what the market is, because there's a lot of confusion out there where they go, well, my buddy wrote this thing and it was what he wanted and he wasn't even trying to make money and he put it out and he made $1 gazillion and it's not fair. And it just happens to be that the buddy is somebody who is reading, well, for example, lit RPG is really hot right now. And I've got a friend who wrote a lit RPG on a lark because they were reading a lot of it and went, this is really fun. I should try doing this. Why not? And it just happened to be that it worked because they were so into that market that they instinctively wrote what that market wanted. And then with other books in that series, we've gone in and added more market research so that it hits the market even more strongly. But that first book was just because they love that thing and other people love that thing. And when you have that crossover, you can hit big success even on a book that is speaking your truth, that is the book of your heart, that is just something you wrote because it would be a gas, and away you go. So that can and does happen. But more often we get the books where they're like, well, it's this genre in a blender with some spice and then some other things. And I don't know who wants to read it, but I really like it. And that's the one where you run into what CJ says. That's great. Write your thing, no matter how weird it is. Write your Tolkien knockoff, whatever it is. But understand that just because you created it doesn't mean the audience has to want to eat it. I'll go back to college where I had a very lovely roommate. And she was just this greatest person, but she was always financially strapped by the end of the month. And so she would look in the fridge and look at the ingredients that she had left. And that last week, the things that she ate, y'all, were amazingly weird. And sometimes it was brilliant. She made rolls and she stuffed them with sausage and with cheese and baked them up. And these were great. The next time that she made them, she put ranch dressing inside of them because that's what she had. So we had rolls with pieces of sausage and ranch dressing and cheese, and it was no longer good. And that addition of the ranch dressing was a mistake. And the market did not want it, even though she ate it and went, it's not bad. And it made my budget stretch for the last week. Why not? Your books can be like that, where you are the one adding the ranch dressing and going, well, it's not bad. But if your audience does not like the ranch dressing, you're not going to get those sales. So it's just knowing really what is it and then setting appropriate expectations so that you know what's going on. And so that when it works or it doesn't work, you're either pleasantly surprised or you go, yeah, I kind of expected that. Now I'm moving on to this thing that I know is more what the audience wants. And there's going to be more commercial viability there. And so that's what it is. So really our goal at the end is to help you find places where you can do some of both, where you can write things you're passionate about that is that heart, but also where you can cross over with a great audience. So you get that, I wrote something I was passionate about and people threw money at me for it. So there we go. So Troy, now I'm going to put this one to you. So Mr. Full-Time Author, is that what everybody should want? Because if you go into Facebook groups, they will tell you that the end goal of all authordom is to be full-time.
And well, okay. So the quick answer is no. And I will first of all say that there are some advantages. Okay, there are some pros and some pluses to it. And one of them is the fact that you can have some accidental successes and you can have some flops, and it doesn't really affect you as much because you've got a lot of other things going on. You should have multiple sources of revenue, multiple sources of income. There's all kinds of things about the business of writing that you need to manage if you're going to write full time. I had one book that I wrote on a dare, quite literally, after I did a 1,000,000-word year. Don't do this, by the way. Don't do a 1,000,000-word year. It's a terrible idea. Even if you're a full-time author, by the end of it, you're just a crazy person rocking in your chair in your room wearing a helmet. But anyway, and it's just not a good picture. But at the end of that year, a friend of mine dared me to do nano with her. I said, I'm not doing that. I don't have anything left to write. Oh, wait, but I do. And I had this silly outline that I created for a webinar that I did for romance authors, which was a romance between Cthulhu and Internet Karen. And they met and they fell in love and they went on adventures and they talked to managers and all that stuff. And it's called The Call of Karen. You can look it up. You can also look up the sequel because I put that book out there with no marketing, no nothing. Was just like, I don't even care if this thing sells. It was a lark to write. It was fun. Who cares? Put it up there. Every company.
That is the best thing ever. I'm going to interrupt you because I didn't know you had written this, and now I must go look it up because I am dying over here. Just
It was so much fun to write. So first of all, it was fun for me, which was great for my muse at that particular point because I was exhausted. I was writing exhausted, right? So I'm like, I'm tired of writing thrillers. I'm trying to write this serious stuff. I'd written that year I wrote 52 short stories in a row, the 52 short story challenge, which by the way, don't do that either. That sucks at the end of the year. But anyway, but the theory is you can't write 52 bad short stories in a row. And some of those short stories were actually pretty good, but they were all pretty serious and kind of my normal genre. So I'm like, I want to do something completely different. Every conference I go to, that book sells out. One of the traveling bookstores that we have that travels around to different conferences, even the ones I don't go to, like almost every conference I go to, I get a little PayPal message, bing, you have money. And I'm like, sales of Call of Karen. I mean, what in the world? Like the dumbest book ever is just one long junior high joke that I wrote during Nano is one of my best-selling books. Now, there's others of my books that I wrote that I thought, this is actually pretty great, and this is going to be pretty cool. And a couple that I wrote with friends of mine that I'm like, oh man, this is going to be a fun series. We're going to write all kinds of books in this. And they petered out, stopped writing those books. And I went, I'm not going to write those anymore either because none of them sold really that well. And they were kind of a flop. So there's some accidental success. But anyway, putting all those things aside, one of the disadvantages of being a full-time writer is that you do not have the time constraints and pressure that you have if you have a job, which we've already kind of talked about. But so part of that is you have to be extremely self-disciplined. You have to be able to set your schedule and keep it, not because anybody else is making you keep it, but because you're making yourself keep it. That is hard to do for anyone. It is hard for me to maintain. Sometimes I have a virtual assistant who sets my schedule for me. So then I follow whatever her schedule was because it tricks my brain into thinking if I don't do this, I'm going to get in trouble, right? Type thing like that, right? So you kind of need some of those constraints. The other thing is you need to love the hustle. At some point, you're going to have to redouble your marketing efforts and redouble some of the efforts that you're doing in order to maintain that living that you want to have and make money. And so there are times when you don't want to do that, and it doesn't matter that you don't want to do that. You have to do it anyway to sustain your lifestyle. So there are some negatives and there are some downsides to it. For me personally, the upsides outweigh the downsides. But there are countless friends that I've had, and I'll let you guys tell about friends that you know as well, that one friend of mine, like she was a fantasy author and an editor full time, and she was rocking it. And she was making six figures, and she was really excited. And she did it for about 2 years and then went, you know what? I'm going back to real estate because my muse needs a break. And she did. And her books were much more successful after she went back to real estate because her brain reset, her creativity reset. So being a full-time author is wonderful if you can do it and you can maintain it, but not everybody can. So it is not the holy grail. It is not the be all of end all. And even if you follow those formulas that people are trying to sell you online, it is highly unlikely that you are going to be the next 6-7 figure author by just following their formula. There's all kinds of other work, personal work included knowing yourself, knowing your personality, knowing your weaknesses, knowing your strengths, all those kind of things. You're going to have to do all of that work in order to maintain your life as a full-time author. So it's not for everyone, but it is for some people. It is for me, but some people just quite simply can't do that. And I don't blame them at all. It is extremely difficult. Jenna, I know you've had some friends that achieved that full-time status and then went, whoa, hey, this isn't what I want. So tell us a little bit about your experience, and then CJ, you follow her with some of yours.
Cool. I have a couple of things. So one of the best and easiest ways to be a full-time author is to have a partner who is a full-time worker. I will put that out there. I know that I've seen people who don't have partners in their lives and they go, it's not fair. You people with people in your lives that have jobs, you have the flexibility. Yeah, that's right. It's absolutely true. It's absolutely not fair, but there you have it. Because my being full-time has been fantastic. But like I say, I got hit with health problems and I get hit with several of them right in a row. And they really, really screwed up my ability to bring in income. And fortunately, I have an amazing partner and his job covered during those times. And so, yes, there is something to be said with hitch your wagon to somebody who has a consistent job while you are full-time authoring, because that way when those things hit that your authoring cannot flex to, you have something to go back to. Now, that also means if you are a full-time author, put money in the bank. When we will talk about a lot of these mindset things and stuff outside of this particular podcast, where we'll have lots of these on some of the things you can do to maintain your career once you've decided what you want. But you do have to think about those kinds of things, because if I didn't have him, I would be SOL for those times that it was, because you don't get insurance and you don't get a lot of those other things that you get with a full-time job. And I would have been doomed the first time I went in for surgery. So there is something to be said for a full-time author with a full-time spouse or partner of whatever sort. That does change things around. And there are a couple of authors that I follow. Probably the most recognizable name is Joe Lallo, who was on the Six Figure Authors podcast. Fantastic. And he talks about his journey there and how it became so hard for him to have so much financial pressure on his books that it stopped him from writing. And he was a strong six-figure author making all this money, and the money started going away because the pressure was making him kind of crazy. And he wasn't able to market properly. He wasn't able to create new books. He had people all yelling at him for different parts of series, and he just couldn't get his muse to work with it. And what it took was for him going back to his developer job. He went back to being a software developer and finally having that structure. Then he was then able to again do all of the book stuff. And he says, yeah, it makes for much longer days, but I'm much productive on both sides. Another favorite author of mine, a romance author, her part-time job is that she works for the Oregon Bureau of Travel. And her part-time job, y'all, and I want her job, I really, really do, is that she has to go and hike the wonderful scenes of Oregon and take pictures of them and do write-ups on why you should visit beautiful Oregon. She has to go and paddleboard and make sure that, is this part of the stream really a great place to go paddleboard? And yes, she spends a lot of office time too, then describing all of those things, but she loves her job, and I can't blame her in the slightest. And for her, it's also, she's able to get out and get the exercise, and this is where ideas hit her. So having a job like that, she's like, I will never leave this job because so much of my inspiration comes from what I'm doing on the job. And I know people who have jobs like that their jobs are very much a place that they draw inspiration from, and that makes the writing better. So there's a lot of people who will never be full-time because being full-time as an author was actually worse for them versus saying, I have this other thing that I do, and then I also author, and look, I can be successful in both of them. So always things to consider. Your life is yours. Only you can make these calls, and you can get advice from people like us. We're happy to talk to you and be your sounding boards and let you talk through it to understand what is it you need in order to keep both your creative life happy, your home life happy, all of those things in balance so that you can have a successful, sustainable career. All right, CJ, take it away.
I think anything I say at this point is really just going to echo exactly what you two have stated. And I think I'll just follow it up with mainly it's the few authors who I've known who've gone to six figures and then decided, oh, that's actually not for me. For them, it was all about work-life balance. So for them, they found that their focus was taken so much away from their own children and from their own family members and their own state of mind and mental health and mood, swayed with the bestseller ranking of their books, the reviews that they got, or even how much money they were getting in the bank, that they found that they needed to place a lot more priority on consistency in a job rather and consistency in their home and what they were doing, what fulfilled them. And so they found that the full-time grind currently with their life or what they were struggling with or what they were doing, they really dialed it back and they had achieved those things. And I'm not going to name names because that would, I don't want to share too much of the personal information, but what they had achieved was stuff that I sat there thinking, man, you did it so fast and so well. And you're going back. But, sometimes you don't figure out what you want until you've hit that goal. And you're like, it's very much all about what happens in books. What you want is not what you need. Many protagonists figure this out. So as you are the protagonist in your own life, you may find as you journey through this, that what you want is not necessarily what you need. And then suddenly what you need becomes exactly, the goal that you should be shooting for. So it is trial and error and something that you will figure out along the way. And we're just jazzed to be here to help you figure it out. So hopefully we can do that. Do we have anything else to chat about before we wrap this up, Troy?
No, that's actually a great segue to what we're going to talk about next week, because what we're going to talk about next week on our next segment is, what do you want from your author career? Like, how do you set goals? How do you identify priorities, and how do you define your commitment to the audience and to yourself and to what you're willing to commit to, the chunk of your life that you're willing to commit to this, either as a career or as a hobby. So what we're trying to do in these first few podcasts is help you develop your own definition of success. And what do you mean by success as an author? So that's what we'll talk about when we see you in our next segment. So thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye, y'all.